look what I found today. A nurse stump. This is perfect because my topic today was supposed to be about our animal logging friends, aka beavers, but the first thing I found when arriving here was a nurse stump with springboard notches in it, which is evidence of our logging history, human logging that is. This is an old fir stump which is nursing a hemlock, a younger hemlock. Well, not that young actually anymore, but you can get nurse logs also. Basically, it just means it's acting as a foundation for a younger tree. But I thought I would explain what a springboard notch is. So if I find this chunk of wood here, back in the old logging days, so maybe 100 years ago, give or take a few decades, because it went on for quite a while, they logged a lot of Bowen Island, and the trees back then were enormous, as they were in most of our province, and especially with cedars, but apparently also with firs, they became much wider at the bottom. So it was easier for the loggers to cut them higher up. So what they did was cut these notches in, which, as you can see, this one has a root of the hemlock growing into it, but it's still a rectangular notch there. And then they would insert a board, which would have been wider and longer and much more stable than this piece of rotten alder here. And so the board would stick out like this, and then they would hop up. And if you come around this side, well, this will have to do for my next springboard. There's another notch up here, and they would stick another one up here. So these agile guys would jump up these springboards with their giant saws, maybe one of those huge two-man saws that they had, and cut the tree off higher up where it wasn't quite so wide. So that is what you're looking at when you find a stump with springboard notches in it. Now off to see the beaver land. So here we are at Killarney Creek, which in my childhood was a lot more narrow and deep than it is now. What happened in the meantime is that the beavers came. So what they did was cut down a lot of trees. Also, as they cut down trees, they built dams. The dams flooded the area, which killed more alder trees because they drowned then. This was sort of a meadow before. And slowly they have transformed what used to be a kind of slightly swampy, marshy meadow into a real wetland. So this area is now full of birds and crayfish, otters, and beavers. And I think it is so beautiful and such an amazing thing to look at, so I'm just going to leave you to look at it for a moment. So here I am standing on a beaver dam. You can see it's a beaver dam and not just a natural, well, beavers are natural, but I mean not just a creation of the creek, because it has a whole bunch of sticks here, which many of them, if you were to look up close, you can actually see the beaver chew marks. They chew them off, drag them over, and create this dam, and then they plug it all up with mud, and then on top of this mud pile, plants grow, making it a pretty permanent fixture. You can see the park rangers are constantly in a battle with them to keep things flowing, because we don't want everything to flood, obviously. So this contraption with the pipe and the cage is meant to keep the water flowing over top of this and I guess foil the beavers. But this was a pretty huge dam, and it still is holding a lot of water in here. And if you look over there, it actually heads over. So somewhere out in that tangle of branches and logs and grass and skunk cabbage, there is actually a beaver lodge where they are presumably happily living. And I thought I'd point out while I'm standing here, all these lilies here are the yellow pond lilies that are so common in this area. So one thing I wanted to show you is the fact that where beavers live, they strip the trees, especially cedar trees. So if you're in an area where beavers are, you will look all along the creek and see stripped trees. So I have stopped here because beavers are not the only thing living here, of course, as I mentioned a little while ago in this video. Otters and crayfish live here. And the reason I know that, other than having seen a few crayfish around, I've never seen an otter right here, but I have found otter poop. And in the otter poop, and also scattered around, having melted out of the otter poop, or washed out I should say, are these gastroliths. It took me a long time to figure out what these are. So gastroliths are something, and it's an adaptation actually that signal crayfish have, with which they basically sequester the calcium from their diet in order that they can grow a new shell when they molt. So a crayfish is a little bit like a lobster, but these live in a freshwater area where there are very few shellfish, and there's just less calcium to be had than there is in the ocean. So basically, they every time they grow, they, like crabs, they molt and they lose their shell, and then they have to grow a new one. But where will they get the calcium to grow the new shell? Well, what they do is they eat their old shell, and in their lifetime also some tiny little freshwater shellfish and things like that. And the calcium that they digest from those things gets stored in these little gastroliths in their stomachs. Basically, well, not stored in them, it's stored as them. So the gastroliths are made of the calcium that the crayfish has ingested. So when it molts, it loses its shell, and all the previously stored calcium in the form of the gastrolith gets reabsorbed and grows into their new shell. So when an otter eats the crayfish, it then poops it out, and there will be little bits of shell pieces as well as these gastroliths. So I had no idea what these were when I first found them with a bunch of kids here, and they were just super interesting, and I had to ask my friend Will, who knows much more than I do about this wilderness, and he was able to explain this to me. I find it fascinating. One of the many things you can discover just by exploring the forest floor. So, just to end off today, I just found this thing on the ground, which looks like a little snarl of slightly felted fluff, and I'm holding it with my bare hands here, wondering whether it is, dissolved out of some, or not dissolved, but came out of some otter poop and the poop dissolved away, or possibly a piece of an owl pellet. There are loads of, what are they called? Barred owls here, and other types, but mostly barred owls in this park. And I don't know, it's just a curious little thing. Yet another thing found by Killarney Creek that I cannot at the moment identify. So happy exploring. See you next time.